Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, here with the Week 7 Game Scores podcast with Adam Rauch. We'll look at our GPP game scores table that Adam developed and helped bring to establish the run. This table, it ranks all the games relative to one another on a slate, and it is definitely key to note that it is relative to one another because it is an ugly slate we have for Week 7. So these games that are in green that rank well in game scores on another week probably wouldn't be in green and ranking well, but relative to all the games on the slate, they do. Adam, we've got a lot of low total games. We're seeing scoring sort of down across the board in the NFL and offense down. Definitely have noticed like completion rates are up, but then yards per completion is down a decent bit. And all that sort of coming to a head here for week 7, where we've got kind of a gross selection of games to pick from.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the totals are really low. The second highest total on the slate is 44.5, just to give you some context. And the highest slate is in the Chargers-Chiefs game, which shouldn't surprise anybody. But, even that game, I'm a little bit uncomfortable because the Chiefs defense has been really good. And both of those offenses are coming off kind of underwhelming performances. So it's just gross all around. The one thing that I think if you're looking for a silver lining on a slate like this, is you could find some pretty unique ways to win. I don't think you're going to be able to play into too many chalky stacks this week. I think really there's only, it's depending on the site, but I think primarily on DraftKings, there's maybe only one chalk stack that you could even work around. We'll get into that, but yeah, it's going to be a gross slate all the way around.
Yeah, and before we dive into specifics, it is interesting to think through on a gross slate. Like, is it more important to correlate or less important? And you can see the argument both ways. I think the argument for it being more important is there's not a ton of good values or individual players that you want to hit. So if you hit on the one game that goes off, you're going to be in a really good position, and it makes sense to correlate more. The sort of contrary argument to that would be that these games aren't likely to go off, and you're better off trying to find, pick and choose the individual values that do the best in the specific game, since you're not going to get a game that hits a real high ceiling. And I go back and forth on this. Sometimes when there's tons of games that rank well, it's tough too for the exact opposite reasons to decide what to do. It's something where I'll mess around with the sims that we have over at Solver to try and help answer that for me a little bit. But ultimately, I do think that it makes sense, on field to just lean into the correlation a little bit more. I think you can get a very low owned, like double stack with a bring back on a week like this, that yes, maybe the odds of it going off are a little bit lower than normal, but also what you need out of that stack is lower than normal.
Yeah, if you really only need one game, one of these weird games to kind of pop, and if you lean into playing that game, like you're going to be situated pretty well. We've got also kind of an interesting scenario where like most of the what I would call appealing games in quotes there, in air quotes there, are on the afternoon slate as well. So could be looking at some late swap opportunities there if you're looking to do that. Yeah, I kind of agree with you though on like that broader point of if we've got a bunch of gross games, we don't know if there's no obvious way to correlate some of the, because there's just no top plays, there's no strong plays, then I'm kind of just looking for that one game where I think, hey, let's kind of like, we can take into account the projections and what the table says, but like even thinking about it holistically, just from like, okay, how do these offenses and defenses interact with each other? Even, despite their totals or their projections, like, I think that's even viable on a slate where the totals are as low as this. So, yeah, I may be looking for just like that one game that could get kind of crazy, while the others may stick around their projected totals.
Yeah. And you did mention late swap, which is important on this slate because I think, you've got the KC Chargers game, which doesn't rate super well in the game scores. We'll talk about that in a second, but that's the one that has by far the highest raw ceiling in it. on the slate, and then that's late. You've got Green Bay at Denver late, which is one of the games that rates pretty well in our game scores, but you possibly could get steamed up on a slate like this, given that it is the second highest total, and there's just been a lot of stuff with Denver. And then you get Arizona at Seattle, which is kind of like in there. That's late, and then the Pittsburgh at the Rams game is late as well, which is kind of an interesting pivot game, I think, to look at. But let's look at this Chargers Chiefs game and why it doesn't rate better in the game scores, given that it's the highest total, it's a gross slate. Like, why not go with Mahomes and the Chargers? And there's a few reasons for it. One, that 48 total is actually like not that high for this game. When you think relatively, I was surprised that total actually wasn't more in the 50s. So we'll sort of see where it ends. But that gives KC, for example, a team total of around 26-27, and the Chargers a team total around like 21. For both those teams, that's like kind of a little bit lower than usual. And then if you look at the prices, especially on DraftKings for the Kansas City side of things, Adam, like it's really expensive. I know it's a slate where you can probably play enough cheaper values to get these guys in and get some access. But when you're talking about an 8,300 Mahomes and an 8K Kelsey, you aren't getting any sort of salary break here whatsoever.
Nope. And you're going to have to make a decision between, well, not just the quarterbacks, because both of them are expensive. I mean, Herbert's also not cheap. But you're going to have to make a decision between Keenan Allen and Travis Kelce and Austin Eckler. You're not going to be able to just kind of lean into all three of those guys and build around in the lineup. It's just too much salary. And, does that mean you want to play into Josh Palmer chalk potentially on DraftKings as well? Because he's kind of a cheap wide receiver value this week. You're going to have to kind of come to a decision point there on who you want to correlate with and how you want to fit it. Keenan and Kelsey are projecting right now as like the chalk ceiling correlation, I guess I'll call that.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense. I mean, despite these teams' relatively like poor offensive performances the last couple of weeks, those two guys continue to produce week in and week out. Keenan was wide open on a potential touchdown on Monday night, and Justin Herbert just overthrew him. Even then, he got in the box. So I think people are going to want to play those two guys. Josh Palmer is going to be popular to pair with on DK. Isaiah Pacheco is going to be chalky on both sides potentially. And I don't know what you think about him, Mike, but his passing role has been kind of getting better and better. So we may even see him in some stack builds. But yeah, it's like, you look at this game, and in like the years past, this total would certainly be in the 50s, probably around 52, I would guess. And I guess that lower total this year is just accounting for kind of like recent biases on how those offenses have performed.
Yeah. And I mean, you hit on it a little bit, but like we don't have these guys as great per dollar values, and they are all like pretty highly owned. If you look at like the top 15, 20 owned players on the slate, you're going to find Josh Palmer, Isaiah Pacheco, Travis Kelce, and Keenan Allen in that group. And then, even Austin Eckler are going to carry some ownership. So I know we'll see where ownership settles. It might be a situation too, where if you have a cheap stack around it, like it's going to be easy to pay up for those guys. And it makes sense to mini correlate it into ownership just to get some of that raw ceiling into your lineup. But I don't think right now it's one that I'll go to a full game stack with a quarterback, kind of just hoping that we get a slate like last week where, I wasn't really on the Ritter stuff, but that was a cheap stack that hit and again, not even in a huge way, but he gets to 300 yards. Drake London gets there on volume. Kyle Pitts gets the touchdown, and it was like good enough. I think that's sort of what we're looking at. And that's part of the reason why the Green Bay Denver game rates so well. We actually have in our projections currently Russell Wilson as the top value quarterback on DraftKings and Jordan Love as the second. So you've got options to pick from there.
That's saying something, by the way.
Yeah, that definitely says something about the slate. We're definitely like old school cheap quarterback slate, I think. And you get decent ceilings on some of the Green Bay guys where their base projection's fine, but because they're more efficiency type players, the ceiling starts to look a little bit better relative to salary. I'm interested to see where the Christian Watson ownership ultimately comes in at. We have it pretty modest right now. I could see, because of the nature of the slate, with it being so gross, everybody being like, just give me the guy with a lot of ceiling against Denver. Um, and if he gets that bump, that's going to affect the game score. But right now, he looks like a really, critical piece to this game because it's a high ceiling player. It's not huge ownership, so that's helping the game scores. And then just, subjectively, Adam, like him hitting speeds the game up quite a bit.
Right. Yeah, we love Christian Watson's big playability. It's great that they're going to get him back in the lineup this week against Denver. So I think he may. I mean, it's you can get burned by guys coming back on their first week or one of their first weeks back from injury. It can get a little dicey, but yeah, I mean, if Watson hits on a big play, that speeds up the game and which speeds up the offensive production. So that would be fun to see. They're also getting Aaron Jones back. And if you get into a spot where Love is just going to be checking down to Aaron Jones, I'm curious to see how they kind of distribute the workload between him and Dillon, because AJ Dillon's just been struggling, would be an understatement. So you've got options here. Luke Musgrave is actually projecting as a decent tight end play. I think he's going to be pretty popular on DraftKings, but he'll even get owned on FanDuel. You know, it's always enticing. Like there's lots of ways you can build a Green Bay stack, and the fact that they're playing Denver certainly makes it more palatable. But yeah, I mean, again, if you're looking at just purely the table, that number, that game score is going to stand out because it's high, it's the highest. But to understand why, it's just like, look, it's affordable. Whatever value there is on the slate, you're finding some of it here in this game, and it's not going to be too heavily owned.
Yeah.
So that's, again, I when people see the table and look at that number, I just want people to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and the Denver side's pretty tricky to pick from. On DraftKings, I think you're probably taking a chance with Sutton or Judy there. We haven't seen Judy break out in the way that we've hoped, but you're talking really low ownership on him as the market kind of starts to view him and Sutton similarly, and Sutton's cheaper, is what's going on there. And even Sutton's not that highly owned either if you want just a little less salary. And then on FanDuel, though, you could take a shot on one of the running backs and just hope, they're both cheap enough in Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin that you could sort of just, hope to run into a touchdown there in that game environment. Sutton and Judy still in play there as well. But the running backs definitely with that wider salary spread at the position on FanDuel start to come into play. On DraftKings, it really seems like a stretch to me to lean in to those backs right now.
Yeah, I think if you play on FanDuel, this is a game you're probably looking at more so.
Yeah, and the way the players score too, like suits the FanDuel scoring, which is going to
Right.
be like hopefully like efficiency as opposed to racking up a ton of volume. Cool. Let's look at the next game in the game scores table. On DraftKings, we have the Washington Giants game. It doesn't rate as well on FanDuel. And part of the reason it rates well on DraftKings is like the Howell double stacks with the high pass rate over expectation for Washington, being able to kind of get multiple Washington pass catchers there on volume, not necessarily efficiency. And do want to note in this game that we've got Daniel Jones assumed in right now for the Giants, but that's definitely not for sure. It may be Tyrod Taylor again.
Yeah, I would be more excited about this game if we had a better feel for the Daniel Jones situation. Um, I think he would actually be a viable play if he was healthy against this Washington defense. So yeah, I don't know. I think you kind of hit all the key points on this game. Like we kind of know why it's grading out the way it does. Everything is relative to the slate. So,
Yeah.
when you have that fraction of value added in there relative to a slate that has little to no value, and then the sheer affordability of it is just going to make it stand out.
Let's look at the Pittsburgh at LA game, which is interesting as top option. This is the third game, so we're on DraftKings, first on FanDuel. This is one that I am like kind of interested in, Adam, where if Pittsburgh can like push things, we know we get really high ceilings on the Rams side of things. I think Cooper Kupp has our highest ceiling projection on the week, and we're also like big into Puka. We're Puka fans here over at ETR. Kind of think what's happened the last couple of weeks. It's easy, I think, for someone who's not looking closely to be like, okay, Cooper Kupp's back, so now Puka's not a thing anymore. But really, he's kind of ran a little bit bad. He still has had very high target shares in the high 20s. He just, he dropped a touchdown last week and they ended up not running a lot of pass plays, period. So I still think there's a lot of ceiling there in a really concentrated offense. So, you could Stafford double those two guys on a week where, because there's a little bit less opportunity cost, I think it's easier for both those guys to get there together, but they're also fine as bringbacks on the Pittsburgh side, which gives you that cheaper stack. We're expecting Deontay Johnson here, and then, Pat Freiermuth as a tight end option. The tight end position's always gross, but particularly so on a slate like this.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you on the broader point of this is a game that I'm kind of interested in. On a slate like this, where again, I think even despite you had mentioned like, hey, if Pittsburgh can push the Rams, hey, that's like, I think that's like the optimal scenario we're hoping for, even though it's probably unlikely. But I also think there's something to say that given the running back situation in LA, like Stafford they may just go pass heavier than usual just by happenstance, but just by default, but the way that they have to operate their offense. So I really like Puka as a play this week. Like his usage has still been great. He's been getting looks, dropped the touchdown last week, but you're saving almost $2,000 on him compared to Cooper Kupp, coming in at way less ownership. If you can make the doubles with Kupp and Nakua work, like good on you. I mean, you're gonna have to pay for it, but I think I'm pretty intrigued by this game, and it certainly helps that Pittsburgh's getting some of their pieces back, even though their offense has really struggled. George Pickens is not. I mean, he's again one of the many bad values on the slate, but if you get a scenario where he breaks off a long touchdown reception, which he has the potential to do, and he has done, then you're running into another game script where it gets kind of sped up. So I think if we can even get lucky on a Pickens long touchdown, this game would be in business.
Yeah, and Deontay Johnson, it really sounds like he's going to play. The injury return game has been one that I've liked to target a lot over the years. It always seems like ownership's depressed on those guys, and a lot of times those guys are healthier than the guys who are like, pop up on the Q tag from the week before, and you're like not sure if they're totally healthy. Whereas the guys that have missed a few weeks and they come back, sometimes those guys are fully healthy and they are good spots to attack. And Deontay's at a pretty affordable price tag, both sites. The running back position's tough with how it's kind of split, but it's kind of same thing that's happening with Denver happens to Pittsburgh on FanDuel, where Najee Harris at 6,100. Just the way that salary spread is, like he's like at least in contention. If you think he can get a goal line tutty there, DraftKings, we have Warren as the better value of the pair, but it's with the full PPR scoring. But the running back slate is like pretty gross too on DraftKings. I should point out that Warren might actually be in play if you're playing Pittsburgh to play from behind in this game and him to get a lot of pass down snaps.
Agreed on all that.
The Arizona-Seattle game is a good one. What's tough is we may see Kenneth Walker with a lot of ownership. Like that's sort of the end result of how bad this running back position is on this slate. It looks quite gross as we're expecting quite a bit of ownership the way of Walker, but he actually has our highest, tied with Austin Eckler as our highest ceiling projection on the slate. That looks like maybe a little bit light for Eckler. We do have Eckler with a higher base projection than Kenneth Walker, but the team total here for Seattle is really good. We have them running more plays than expected and also have the pass rate a little bit lower given the game script. And we know on the Arizona side of things, Adam, they're not a very good offense, but at times they've been more capable than we expected. And when they are, it's a lot of short completions to guys like Marquise Brown, Zach Ertz, that can give them decent fantasy days, even if the ceilings aren't huge.
I mean, I don't know about, I mean, we've got the top value on the slate in this game, Mike. I mean, I don't know why you're not more excited about Marquise Brown being the top value on the slate on DraftKings. I mean,
that's the nature of this slate.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't believe you glossed over that. I mean, he's just a screaming value, a screaming value. But yeah, this kind of just goes back to like how offenses and defenses interact with each other. Arizona's defense, they've they gave a kind of a large, like a high scoring performance to LA last week. Again, we're talking like Cup and Stafford there versus Geno and his cast of receivers. But this one is also intriguing to me. I would like to think that Geno Smith would be in play here. I mean, he's actually one of the few like solid QB values on FanDuel this week, so I think he's definitely in play there. Especially the way that their offense operates. They have. With Lockett, usually is kind of like an efficiency receiver. Metcalf, in the past has kind of shown volume receiver tendencies, but this year just hasn't produced that, so to speak. So, I mean, his kind of profile maybe fits more of the FanDuel type as well. And Seattle kind of was. I mean, they got up to a good start last week. I mean, that Bengals Seahawks game we were both on. And it just kind of fell flat in the second half. So we're kind of hoping that maybe, Seattle gets back home against a weaker defense. Maybe if we can get Arizona to push a little bit, maybe we'll get Geno in a pass heavier game script. This is, again, it's a gross thought, but Seattle's offensive line is getting healthier, which hopefully means we can get JSN on the field more in 3 wide receiver sets as opposed to them going heavy tight end. So, I think even that might be viable. But yeah, I'd be looking at this game. I think I'd probably favor a Geno stack, maybe with an Arizona bring back.
Yeah, the thing that Geno stack gives you too, especially on DraftKings, is leverage off of what's going to be a very chalky Kenneth Walker. Now, I do think in some real small field tournaments, you can play Kenneth Walker in Geno stuff and just onslaught Seattle and hope they're like the highest scoring team of the week. And that's a strategy, we didn't really hit on that I've seen work on normal slates, but that's one too that I think has a little bit more upside on a gross slate where the ceiling on the scores that are going to win DFS tournaments are a little bit lower. It opens up more paths to like, hey, this team does really well. You get 2 team players on the team that do fine and 1 player that does amazing, and you're good to go. Having those 2 fine players doesn't kill you.
I mean, that worked last week for Levitan. And, last week was kind of not as gross of a slate as this, but it wasn't a super enticing slate. And he just kind of leaned into the Miami, Carolina onslaught, and it worked out pretty well for him in his small field tourney. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely viable, especially on a slate like this. Like, you got to just find that one game. You don't necessarily have to have top 1% ceiling outcomes to get there.
The last one to talk about is the Detroit at Baltimore game. And with David Montgomery injured and the matchup against Tampa Bay last week, we really saw Detroit for the first time this year lean into the pass. They had a really high pass rate over expectation, resulted in big game for Goff, really big game for Amon-Ra St. Brown. And but I'm a little worried about them on the road in Baltimore, that this could be a bit of a grosser game. We'll see what happens with the Jahmyr Gibbs ownership and what the usage looks like for him with David Montgomery out. But I do think on the Baltimore side, though, there's a little bit more juice than we've seen so far this year. They've kind of run bad in terms of the number of touchdowns they've scored. And Lamar's not a great individual value, but you've got Lamar to Andrews, Lamar to Zay Flowers, one of those skinny stacks on a slate like this. I'm willing to accept a little bit less base value for the ceiling potential there.
And you can build a lot of different combos on this game. It's affordable enough. Like you could do Lamar with Zay plus Amon-Ra. You could even do Lamar and Mark Andrews plus Amon-Ra. If you wanted to mix in Sam Laporta, like he's never. I mean, he's shown that he's got a established role week in and week out. So, yeah, I mean, Detroit on the road is definitely different than Detroit at home. But I mean, Goff has been playing well enough where I'm not mad if you want to play him. Not a great individual play, but like I wouldn't be upset at it. You're not going to have to worry about this game getting steamed up, I think, too much. Maybe outside of Gibbs. So if you want to lean into the pass catcher stack, by all means, I think that's more than fine. Again, and maybe if you're thinking about playing Lamar, maybe FanDuel is the more appropriate place to play him, given his style of play and how that offense has actually produced this year, where you may need to run on more efficiency as opposed to volume. But I'd be fine playing it on both sides, to be honest.
Okay, Adam, it's time for dirt plants. I feel like I got a feeling where you're going to go. I'll let you go first, though.
The whole week. The whole slate. No, it's a gross slate. I mentioned this guy a little bit earlier. It's pretty gross, but I think if we get the right run out on Seattle's health, especially on their offensive line, if we get some more 3 wide receiver sets, maybe we start seeing a little bit more JSN this week. Maybe he gets a little bit more involved in the offense, playing against a weaker defense at home. No one's wanting to click him. I mean, he's underperformed, way below everyone's expectations, but he's a good price. And on a weird slate like this, if you're needing just a couple of weird plays in a game to hit, maybe JSN is going to be one of them. So I'll go Jackson Smith and Jigba.
I knew it. I knew that's where you were going. I think it makes sense. It is a week too that you can be a little bit more contrarian, but for people who are fresh to the dirt plant segment, this is kind of a play on the flag plant segment on Established the Millie, where take a little bit of a grosser play that makes a game stack work. For me, I'm going to do the injury return game with Deontay Johnson, where definitely some uncertainty there. Does he come in and immediately see the target share that he saw previously, with Pickett and basically the last few seasons, or does Pickens, kind of stay ahead there? But I'm willing to take my shot on, a gross week where if he can just rack up a ton of catches and I can correlate that with some of the high ceiling Rams pass catchers, I'm pretty satisfied.
I like that. Yep. I think I'll be definitely looking at Deontay and maybe some stacks in that game as well.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. If you are a subscriber to Establish the Run, you can also check out Establish the Million. This weekend, I'll have Adam Levitan and Gary Hartman on the show. Drew's not going to be able to make it, so we're bringing in those guys. Gary does great stuff with MME, and Adam's just one of the best field players out there, so make sure to check that out. And good luck in all your contests.